and it's where podcasters can recommend other podcasts, and it shows up as a list on their website or also in the RSS feed or on Podcasting 2.0 supporting apps. I have a Podroll, and it is all carefully curated other sleep podcasts that I think my listeners will like. If you go to Buzzcast, we have a carefully curated list of like other podcasts about podcasting we think you'll like. But we also have our own podcasts in there. So, if you're in a network or something like a collective, you can actually promote other podcasts that are in your network.
Welcome back to Podcasting 2.0 in practice. I'm here today with Jordan Blair. Hi, Jordan. How are you?
I am so good. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Tell me, please, give me your introduction and tell us a bit about who you are and your podcast credentials.
Yes. Okay. I have a few of those. So I am the podcast producer at Buzzsprout. And I get to work a lot with like the communities and helping podcasters get started podcasting and just kind of supporting them in their journey. And I also host Buzzcast, which is the podcast about all things podcasting. And I also host Dreamful Bedtime Stories, which was my little baby project podcast that got me started in podcasting. That's how I learned to podcast. And then I also produce some other shows for Buzzsprout. So those are my credentials. Quick and dirty there.
Brilliant. Thank you. This time, we're going to talk about one of my favorite features because it's just so lovely and kind. And I feel the effectiveness of it for discoverability is just so wide. So, Jordan, do tell us, what is Podroll?
Yeah, I think that is exactly it. You kind of hit the nail on the head there with discoverability. I feel like I've gotten the fun discoverability chapters here, and that's like one of my favorite things. I'm very excited about it. Okay, so Podroll, it is reminiscent of a blog roll from like the early 2000s. Blogging was huge, and so bloggers had on their websites, usually on like the side of the blog, there was like a list of hyperlinks to other websites, other reading, other things that they recommended. And it just kind of like enhanced the experience of the viewer of the blog. They were able to be recommended things by the blogger, or the blogger could say like, hey, for more information, go to this. And so this is the podcast equivalent of a blog roll. It's called Podroll, and it's where podcasters can recommend other podcasts, and it shows up as a list on their website or also in the RSS feed or on Podcasting 2.0 supporting apps. So it's very fun.
Yeah, and it's based on the trust of you, so, for example, somebody's listening to Creativity Found.
Yes.
And I will put in my Podroll other shows that I think they'll like because they like my show or because they like me, that kind of thing. And it's actually coming from that real person. And I think that's why it's so lovely and useful and trusted.
Yeah. And there's so many different uses for the Podroll. I mean, it's really easy. You just, let me backtrack for just like a second here. It's very easy to add a podcast to your Podroll. You just go to your Podroll page on your podcast hosting site and you type in the podcast to add it. And you just click add. It's very simple. It's not like a complicated thing. You can just search the podcast in the database and add them to your Podroll. That being said, there's more uses for it than just like creating like a curated playlist. So for example, like my bedtime story podcast, I have a Podroll, and it is all carefully curated other sleep podcasts that I think my listeners will like. If you go to Buzzcast, we have a carefully curated list of like other podcasts about podcasting we think you'll like. But we also have our own podcasts in there. So, if you're in a network or something like a collective, something like that, you can actually promote other podcasts that are in your network. There's so many different things you can do. You could use Podroll for promo swaps. So if you tell like one podcaster, hey, I'll put you on and, you put me on your Podroll and we'll do it for like this year or, something like that. If you have guests on that have other podcasts, you can tell your listeners, hey, I've actually linked to their podcast in my Podroll. You can have like fan spotlights and self-promotion and all sorts of different things. You could even do like monthly, I think of book reading lists, like the book club sort of thing. You could totally have themed monthly playlists on your Podroll. And that's just like some ideas I have for it, but I'm sure other people are like, oh, I could use it for something way better than that. But yeah, there's just so many things you can do with it.
Yeah, that's really creative. I love the look on your face. You're getting all excited about all the possible things.
I do get excited. It's very fun.
It is very fun. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that variety of it. Obviously, I've got particular shows on the Podrolls for this show and for Creativity Found, but I love that idea of like a reading list or a book list type thing.
Yes.
Or all sorts of things. Christmas.
Oh, yeah. Best Christmas podcasts. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that are turning their audiobooks into podcasts, which is kind of interesting. And so you actually kind of could do a sort of like audiobook reading list on your podcast too. Yeah. Or if you have an education podcast and you say like, hey, if you want to like dive further into this topic, I recommend this other podcast. And I have that linked in my Podroll. So yeah, there's just, oh man, so many cool uses for it.
We'll just leave that open for everybody to have their own inventive ideas about how they're going to use their Podroll. So how can people connect with you, Jordan?
Yeah, so I am on Twitter at JordanPods. I guess it's X now. Whatever, who cares? And it's at JordanPods. I can also be found on... I'm not on a lot of things. I can also be found on Instagram at Dreamful Podcast, but that's really just my personal Instagram account. And I can also be found quite often in the Buzzsprout Facebook community group. We have like 45,000 members in there. And that's honestly, I recommend joining that group and hanging out with all of us. But I'm constantly in there. So you can find me in there for sure.
Yeah, I recommend joining that group as well.
It's very good.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Visit creativityfound.co.uk/podcasting to find out more about my guests and access lots of useful podcast resources. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send a boost. But if you haven't got to that lesson yet, feel free to reach out to me on my Instagram account at podcasting2.0 in practice.